Martin Coldwell was fixing a fence post when he heard the sound that would change everything. A sound he recognized from 50 years of living in the Arizona territory. A sound that meant someone's Tuesday was about to get considerably worse than his. Gunfire. Not the playful pops of a cowboy practicing his aim or the distant crack of a hunter taking down dinner. This was the sustained, methodical rhythm of an execution. He straightened up slowly, his back protesting with the kind of creaks and pops that suggested his spine was held together by stubbornness and spite. At 85 years old, Martin had earned every one of those sounds. He'd been shot twice, stabbed once, thrown from more horses than he cared to count, and had survived 3 marriages. The last wife outliving him would have been the real miracle, but 2 had passed from natural causes and 1 from what the doctor diplomatically called an unfortunate encounter with preserves gone bad. The fence post could wait. Hell, the fence post had been waiting for 3 weeks already. Another hour wouldn't kill it. Martin dropped his hammer and shuffled toward his cabin with the gait of a man whose knees had filed for retirement 2 decades ago, but kept getting called back for one more job. His property sat in what locals called the Mixing Bowl, a stretch of Arizona territory where every kind of person the West had to offer ended up living practically on top of each other. Not by choice necessarily, but by the peculiar mathematics of cheap land and expensive everywhere else. To his south, the Freeman family worked a decent spread. Black folks who'd come west after emancipation looking for the kind of freedom that didn't come with a former master breathing down their necks. To his north, the Rodriguez clan ran cattle with the kind of expertise that came from generations of doing it before Arizona was even a gleam in America's eye. Scattered around were Chinese families, Apache who hadn't been forced onto reservations, and a motley collection of whites who ranged from decent to deplorable. Martin had made it his policy to judge people by their character rather than their color, partly because he was too old to waste energy on hatred, and partly because hatred had a way of making enemies out of potential allies, and in the Arizona territory you needed all the allies you could get. He reached his cabin and grabbed the Winchester from above the door, a rifle he'd carried during his years as a territorial ranger, back when his knees worked and his aim was something to be feared rather than pitied. The weapon was older than most of the buildings in the nearest town, but it still fired true. Martin had made sure of that because a man who didn't maintain his tools was a fool, and Martin Coldwell was many things, but a fool wasn't one of them. The gunfire was coming from the direction of the Freeman homestead. Martin's gut clenched. The Freemans were good people. Hard-working, honest, the kind of neighbors who'd help you mend a fence or bring you soup when you were sick. Josiah Freeman and his wife Ruth had 4 children, ranging from a teenager down to a boy barely old enough to work a plow. They'd been making a go of it, building something solid in this hard land. The past tense of that thought scared Martin more than he wanted to admit. He walked to his horse, a process that involved considerable negotiation with both the horse and his own body. His mare, a patient creature named Dusty who was nearly as old as Martin felt, seemed to sense the urgency. Or maybe she just wanted to get the saddle situation over with before Martin's back gave out entirely. "We're riding toward trouble," Martin informed the horse as he hauled himself into the saddle with all the grace of a sack of grain. "I'd apologize, but you've known me long enough to expect this kind of nonsense." Dusty snorted, which Martin chose to interpret as resigned acceptance. The ride to the Freeman place took 10 minutes that felt like an hour. Martin's mind was racing ahead, cataloging possibilities, calculating odds, and generally preparing for the kind of situation where an 85-year-old man with arthritic hands and questionable eyesight probably shouldn't be inserting himself. But preparation and good sense had never been particularly well acquainted in Martin's life, and he saw no reason to introduce them now. What he found when he crested the ridge made his blood run cold despite the desert heat. The Freeman homestead was a scene of carnage. Bodies lay in the dirt. Too many bodies, too still. A group of riders, maybe 7 or 8, were systematically going through the property, their movements efficient and practiced. These weren't opportunistic thieves or desperate men making bad choices. These were professionals in the business of death. Martin recognized the type. He'd fought men like this during his ranger days, back when the territory was even wilder than it was now. They wore no uniform, but they moved with military precision. Bandanas covered their faces. Not the red-checkered kind that had been popular with certain gangs, but solid black, like they were mourning something. Maybe their own humanity. One of the riders was pursuing something, someone. Martin's old eyes squinted, trying to make sense of the small figure running across the open ground. A child. A boy. Running with the desperate, uncoordinated panic of someone who just watched his world end. The rider chasing him was taking his time, letting his horse walk, enjoying the hunt. Men like that existed, Martin knew. Men who'd had something break inside them, leaving nothing but cruelty and the pleasure of causing pain. Martin had spent 50 years in the territory dealing with such men. He'd arrested some, killed others when arrest wasn't an option, and watched a few hang when the law finally caught up with them. He'd thought he was done with that chapter of his life, that he'd earned the right to fix fence posts and complain about his joints and die peacefully in his sleep. Apparently, the universe had other plans. The boy, Martin could see now he was black, probably one of the younger Freeman children, had made it maybe 100 yards before his small legs betrayed him. He stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. The rider was 20 yards behind him, pulling his pistol with the casual ease of a man who'd done this before. Martin kicked Dusty into motion. The horse, bless her ancient heart, responded with something that might generously be called a canter. They came in from an angle the rider wasn't watching, because men like him never expected threats from old men on older horses. "Hey!" Martin's voice cracked across the desert air like a whip, loud and sharp with the authority of someone who'd spent decades making dangerous men listen. "That's about far enough." The rider turned, surprised. Up close, Martin could see he was young. Couldn't have been more than 30, with hard eyes that had seen too much violence and not enough consequences. His hand was still on his pistol, still aimed in the direction the boy had been running. "Old man," the rider said, his voice flat and uninterested. "You're making a mistake. Ride away." "I've made plenty of mistakes in my 85 years, Martin replied, bringing his Winchester up with hands that remembered this motion even if they shook doing it. "Getting involved in other people's murders ain't usually one of them, but I'm flexible in my old age." The rider's eyes narrowed. He was calculating odds, Martin could see it, weighing whether this old man was a threat or just a nuisance to be eliminated. Martin made the decision for him. The rifle kicked like it always had, and Martin's aim was still good enough when it counted. The bullet caught the rider in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse with a shout of pain and surprise. His pistol went flying, landing in the dirt several feet away. The other riders, who'd been busy with their grim work at the homestead, suddenly realized their afternoon had been interrupted. Martin didn't waste time on clever remarks or dramatic gestures. He rode straight for the boy, who was staring at him with eyes so wide they looked like they might swallow his whole face. "Up!" Martin barked, reaching down. "Now, son. Unless you want to discuss this situation at length, while those gentlemen ride over here to express their displeasure." The boy moved on pure instinct, grabbing Martin's arm. The old man hauled him up with strength that surprised them both. Fear and necessity make excellent motivators, and settled the child in front of him on the saddle. The boy was shaking so hard Martin could feel it through his whole body, and he was making small, wounded sounds that Martin recognized from his ranger days. That was the sound of someone who'd just lost everything. The other riders were coming now, fanning out, moving to surround them. Martin did some quick arithmetic. 7 riders, maybe 6 rounds in the Winchester if he was lucky, 1 old man, 1 traumatized child, and a horse that was already breathing hard. The numbers weren't good. But then something happened that Martin hadn't anticipated, though perhaps he should have. From the north, the Rodriguez family came riding in. Miguel and his 4 sons, all armed, all looking like they'd taken the phrase "love thy neighbor," and added a footnote about showing up with rifles when said neighbor was in trouble. From the south came more riders, looked like folks from the other black settlement, 5 miles down the road, led by a man named Joshua who Martin had helped out with a land dispute last year. And from the east, silent as death itself, came 5 Apache warriors who probably had their own reasons for disliking men who massacred families, though they weren't the type to explain their motivations to anyone. The riders in black suddenly found themselves outnumbered 3 to 1, surrounded by an alliance of people who had nothing in common except a mutual respect for an old man who minded his own business but stepped up when it mattered. What followed was brief, loud, and decisive. When the dust settled, 4 of the riders were dead, 2 were wounded and captured, and 1 had managed to escape, though he'd have interesting scars to remember the occasion. Martin sat on Dusty, holding the boy who'd buried his face in Martin's shirt and was crying with the kind of sobs that come from a place so deep there are no words for it. The old man's hands were trembling now, adrenaline fading and leaving behind the reality of what had just happened. What he'd just done, what he'd just seen. Miguel Rodriguez rode up, his weathered face concerned. "Martin, you crazy old bastard, what were you thinking?" "Wasn't thinking," Martin admitted, his voice rough. "Just acting. Thinking seems overrated when children are involved." Joshua approached from the other side, dismounting. "Mr. Coldwell, you saved that boy's life. You know that, right?" Martin looked down at the child. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, still shaking, still crying. "I know I did something. Whether it was smart is debatable." One of the Apache warriors, a man Martin knew as Night Wolf from previous encounters, rode closer and gave him a nod of respect. He said something in Apache that Martin didn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. "He says you have warrior's heart," Miguel translated, looking amused. "That's high praise, coming from him." "Tell him I have an old man's stubbornness and poor impulse control," Martin replied, but he nodded back at Night Wolf with genuine appreciation. The next hour was spent dealing with the aftermath. The Freeman family, Josiah, Ruth, their eldest daughter, and a middle son, were dead, murdered with the kind of efficiency that spoke of practice. Only the youngest boy, the one Martin had saved, had survived by sheer chance. He'd been hiding in the root cellar when the attack started and had only emerged after the shooting stopped, running on pure terror. The town sheriff eventually arrived, summoned by one of Miguel's sons. Sheriff Blackwood was a practical man who understood that justice in the Arizona Territory didn't always look like it did in law books. "Self-defense and defense of others," he declared after surveying the scene. "Clear as mountain water. Martin, you're a hero." "I'm an old man who got lucky," Martin corrected, "and I need to sit down before I fall down." They took him back to his cabin, along with the boy, who refused to let go of Martin's hand. The child hadn't spoken a word since being rescued, and Martin didn't push him. Sometimes silence was the only language trauma knew, and it needed time to find other words. The community responded the way frontier communities did when crisis struck. The Rodriguez family brought food and offered to help with funeral arrangements. The black settlement folks brought supplies and offered to take the boy in if needed. Even the Apache left game at Martin's door, their way of showing support without words. The boy, his name was Samuel, Martin learned from Joshua, who'd known the Freeman family, stayed with Martin that night and the next night and the one after that. It turned out Samuel had an aunt in Kansas City who'd been writing to the family about visiting. She was contacted, and arrangements were being made for Samuel to go live with her. In the meantime, Martin found himself in the unexpected role of guardian to a traumatized child who'd lost everything in a handful of violent minutes. They developed a routine. Martin would make breakfast, simple fare that wouldn't shame him but wouldn't win any prizes either. Samuel would help with small tasks, finding comfort in routine. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, Martin in his old chair and Samuel on the steps, watching the sun paint the desert in impossible colors. It was during one of these evenings, about a week after the massacre, that Samuel finally spoke. "Why did you save me?" His voice was small but clear, with the kind of directness children have before the world teaches them to talk around things. Martin considered the question carefully. "Didn't need a reason, son. You needed saving, and I was there. Sometimes it's that simple. My pa used to say that people like us, black folks, we can't count on others to help. That we have to look after our own." "Your pa wasn't wrong," Martin said honestly. "The world's got a lot of ugliness in it, more than it should. But ugliness ain't the whole story. Your pa was a good man who loved his family and worked hard. That counted for something." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared when you rode out to save me?" Martin laughed, a dry sound like whined through dead grass. "Scared? Boy, I was terrified. My hands were shaking so bad I'm amazed I hit anything. But being scared and doing what needs doing, those aren't opposites. You can be both at once." Over the next 2 weeks, preparations were made for Samuel's journey to Kansas City. His aunt had been contacted and was preparing to receive him. The community took up a collection to help with expenses. Even Night Wolf's Apache group contributed, though they did so anonymously, leaving money tied in a cloth at Martin's door. The night before Samuel was due to leave, Martin made a special dinner. Well, special was generous. It was the same stew he always made, but he'd added extra meat and had actually used spices beyond salt and hope. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people have shared something difficult and found unexpected kinship in it. After dinner, as Martin was cleaning up, Samuel brought out a small wooden box. "This was in my pocket when I ran," he said quietly. "I forgot I had it until today." He opened the box. Inside was an old pocket watch, tarnished silver with intricate engraving on the case. Even in the lamplight, Martin could see it was quality work, the kind of timepiece that spoke of craftsmanship and care. "It was my grandfather's," Samuel said. "My pa's pa. I never met him, he died before I was born. But my pa gave this to me the morning of that day. Said I should keep it safe, that it was important." Martin felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he didn't know why yet. He just knew that sometimes objects carried weight beyond their physical presence. Samuel carefully opened the watch. Inside the case was an inscription, engraved in careful script. "To JT, may you find peace where war failed to take you. A.M." And beneath that, a photograph, old, faded but clear enough. It showed a man in his 30s, hard-faced and wearing the kind of clothes Martin associated with a very specific period in his life. Period he'd tried to forget. Martin's breath stopped. He knew that face. He'd seen it in his nightmares for 20 years after putting a bullet in it. "My grandmother said he was an outlaw," Samuel continued, unaware that Martin had gone completely still. "Said he rode with a gang that did terrible things. But she also said he was trying to leave that life, trying to be better. He met her, my grandmother, and fell in love. She was a freed slave working at a boarding house in New Mexico territory." Martin's hands had started trembling again, but this time it had nothing to do with age or adrenaline wearing off. "They kept it secret," Samuel went on, his child's voice recounting a story he'd clearly been told many times. "An outlaw and a black woman. Folks wouldn't have understood. But they loved each other anyway. He promised he'd leave the gang, that they'd start over somewhere new." The cold in Martin's stomach had spread to his chest, squeezing like a vice. "But he never got the chance," Samuel said softly. "There was a raid. His gang hit a payroll wagon. Rangers tracked them down. There was a shootout. My grandfather was killed. My grandmother didn't even know she was pregnant yet. Martin was going to be sick. He was going to faint. He was going to... She raised my pa alone," Samuel continued. "Told him stories about his father. Said that people make mistakes, but that doesn't mean they can't change, can't be better. Said love was stronger than all the bad things someone had done." The watch was still in Martin's hands, heavy as a millstone. He looked at the inscription again. JT, Jesse Tanner. The name hit Martin like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd buried deep. Jesse Tanner, leader of the Tanner gang, responsible for 3 bank robberies, 2 payroll heists, and the death of a deputy marshal. Martin had been part of the ranger company that tracked them down in 1863. There'd been a shootout in a canyon in New Mexico territory. 4 gang members died that day. Jesse Tanner had been one of them. Martin had fired the shot that killed him. He'd been 28 years old, a young ranger doing his duty, taking down dangerous men who'd made their choices. Jesse Tanner had been reaching for his gun when Martin shot him. It was clean, justified, necessary. Martin had never lost sleep over it because men like Jesse Tanner made their own fate. Except now, looking at this child sitting across from him, Martin realized that fate was more complicated than young rangers understood. Jesse Tanner had been trying to leave the outlaw life. He'd been in love. He'd been about to become a father. And Martin Coldwell had ended all of that with one well-placed bullet through the heart. And now, impossibly, the grandson of the man Martin had killed was sitting in Martin's cabin, having been saved by Martin from another gang of killers, holding the pocket watch that had probably been in Jesse Tanner's pocket when he died. My pa said this watch was all he had of his father, Samuel said, running his small fingers over the engraving. Said it reminded him that people are complicated, that nobody's all good or all bad, that we all deserve a chance to be better. Martin tried to speak, but his throat had closed up completely. Samuel looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. I want you to have it, Mr. Coldwell. No. Martin finally managed to croak out. No, son, that's your family history. Your grandfather's. My grandfather would want you to have it, Samuel said with the stubborn certainty that only children possess. You saved my life. You're part of my story now. And... He paused, seemed to struggle for words. And I think maybe we were supposed to meet, like maybe things happen for a reason. Martin took the watch with hands that were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The engraving blurred as tears he didn't know he had started forming in his eyes. Maybe we were, son, he whispered. Maybe we were. The room tilted. Martin felt himself swaying in his chair. 62 years of guilt and understanding an impossible coincidence crashing over him like a flash flood. He'd killed Jesse Tanner. He'd orphaned Samuel's father before the boy was even born. He'd set in motion a chain of events that led to Samuel growing up without a grandfather, that shaped the Freeman family's history in ways Martin had never known. And now he'd saved Jesse Tanner's grandson from the same kind of violence that had taken Jesse's life. The universe had a sense of irony that would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. The last thing Martin heard before everything went black was Samuel's frightened cry, Mr. Coldwell! When Martin woke up, he was in his own bed with what seemed like half the territory crowded into his small cabin. Miguel Rodriguez was there with his wife. Joshua was standing by the window looking worried. The Apache medicine man was waving smoking herbs that smelled like sage and consequences. And Samuel was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Martin's hand and crying. I'm sorry, the boy kept saying. I didn't mean to make you sick. I was just showing you the watch. Martin's voice came out as a croak. Not your fault, son. Just old man problems. The doctor, a practical man named Chun who'd seen enough frontier drama to be unflappable, checked Martin's pulse and eyes. Your heart's strong as an ox, Martin, but you gave everyone quite a scare. What happened? Martin looked at Samuel, at the pocket watch still clutched in the boy's small hand, and made a decision. Some truths were too heavy for children to carry. Some revelations would only add weight to a burden already too great. Samuel was going to Kansas City to start a new life, away from the trauma and loss. He didn't need to know that the man who'd saved him was the same man who'd killed his grandfather. Just got overwhelmed, Martin said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Realized how close we came to losing this boy, and my old heart couldn't handle it. Samuel squeezed his hand. But you didn't lose me. You saved me. Martin squeezed back, looking at this child who was, impossibly, connected to him by threads of violence and redemption that spanned generations. I suppose I did. The next morning, when the stage came to take Samuel to the train station in Tucson, Martin stood on his porch and watched the boy prepare to leave. Joshua had volunteered to escort him, along with another man from the black settlement, ensuring Samuel would reach Kansas City safely. Before Samuel climbed into the stage, he ran back to Martin and threw his arms around the old man's waist. I'll never forget you, he said fiercely. Never. You better not, Martin replied, his voice gruff to hide the tears. I didn't go through all that excitement just to be forgotten by some youngster. Samuel pulled back and smiled, the first real smile Martin had seen from him. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch. I want you to have this, he said, pressing it into Martin's hand before the old man could protest. Please, it's important. Martin closed his fingers around the watch, feeling the weight of history, of choices made decades ago, of consequences that echoed forward through time in ways no one could predict. Thank you, son, he whispered. He watched the stage disappear into the desert dust, taking with it a piece of his heart and a weight of guilt he'd never known he'd been carrying. In his hand, the pocket watch felt warm, almost alive, a bridge between past and present, between the young ranger he'd been and the old man he'd become. between Jesse Tanner's death and Samuel Freeman's life. That evening, Martin sat on his porch and opened the watch one more time. Jesse Tanner looked back at him from the old photograph, hard-faced and serious, a man who'd made terrible choices but had been trying to change. Next to him in Martin's memory was Samuel's face, that trusting smile, that fierce goodbye hug. "You old fool," Martin whispered to the photograph. "You were trying to be better, and I didn't give you the chance." But then, Martin reflected, the West was full of such stories. Full of choices made in the moment that echoed forward through generations. Full of violence that begot more violence until somewhere along the line someone chose differently. Jesse Tanner had chosen love over outlawry. Martin had chosen to save a child rather than mind his own business. Samuel would grow up knowing that a white man had risked his life to save a black child, that communities of different colors and cultures had come together to fight evil. Maybe that was redemption, not erasing the past, but building something different in the present. Martin closed the watch and clutched it to his chest, feeling the weight of 62 years of consequence, of guilt, of unexpected grace. Outside, the desert was settling into evening, painting the sky in those impossible colors that made artists weep. The wind carried sounds from his neighbors, Miguel's family talking in Spanish, the distant sound of hymns from the black settlement, something that might have been Apache drums or might have been thunder. This was the West, Martin thought. Not the simple version from dime novels, where heroes were pure and villains were obvious. This was the real West, where outlaws fell in love with freed slaves, where old rangers saved the grandchildren of men they'd killed, where communities of every color came together when it mattered. It was messy and complicated and brutal and beautiful all at once. Just like redemption. Martin smiled, tucked the watch into his pocket, and decided that 85 years was long enough to carry guilt. He had a few more years left in him, and maybe, just maybe, he'd spent them knowing that in the end he'd chosen right. Though next time the universe decided to teach him lessons about consequence and redemption, it could do so with slightly less drama and fewer fainting spells. A man his age needed to pace himself, after all.